Welcome to Hello Therapy, a podcast to help you take charge of your mental health through evidence-based psychological tips and tools straight from the therapy room so that you can live life better. How do we rebuild our lives and relationships after experiencing the profound pain of reproductive trauma? In this episode, I'm talking with Dr Michelle Tolfrey, a clinical psychologist with lived experience of baby loss. Alongside her private therapy practice, Michelle is founder of the Loss Collective and writes the Substack newsletter From the Other Chair, which provides a wealth of information on navigating life after loss and finding joy in living the life you didn't expect or plan. This conversation is a deep exploration of the multifaceted nature of reproductive trauma, and Michelle shares practical strategies for gradually building resilience after a loss, managing painful triggers, and the importance of community and professional support in the healing journey. So if your life has been touched by miscarriage, pregnancy loss, stillbirth, or other reproductive traumas, then this episode offers invaluable insights and compassionate guidance to help you through that journey. So let's dive in. So Michelle, thank you so much for joining me on the Hello Therapy podcast. It's so nice for you to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be able to come and talk to another psychologist and about something that I'm really, really interested in.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our chat because I haven't had anyone on to talk about reproductive trauma before. And it is obviously a huge topic. And I've worked with quite a number of women over the years who have experienced reproductive trauma. So it'd be really great to get your insights.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you're saying that as well, because I think often we can think that we'd only see or work with people in specialist services who have gone through this, but actually I don't think it really matters where you see someone or in what context. This touches so many people's lives, and I think actually it's just good for us all to be really aware of what it means, what it is, what the impact is, and actually how we can all help, whether it's as a psychologist, as a friend, a sibling, a parent, because the impact is so wide-reaching that I do think that all of us could be more equipped to have conversations with people who are impacted by this.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you want to tell our listeners who you are and what you do, first of all?
So it's always a good question. I never know how to answer it. So I'm Michelle Tolfrey. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I have been working in psychology for over 20 years now. And I used to work in the NHS for a really long time, but now I just work independently. I run an organisation called the Loss Collective. And really that's an organisation that is about trying to get out information and support to people who've been through reproductive trauma and loss. And so I help people find the right support for them. So I have a particular sort of specialist interest in my work in people who've experienced sort of loss and trauma on the whole reproductive journey. And part of that interest is sparked by my own lived experience of loss. So I've had sort of early loss. I've also had loss much later in pregnancy. I experienced the full-term stillbirth of my first daughter. I guess I know there's more psychologists doing this these days, but certainly it can feel sometimes a little bit different to be someone who does speak very openly about my own personal experiences. And I weave those very much into the work that I do. It's obviously given me a different insight and understanding in kind of what this feels like and how you learn to live alongside it. Because it was really hard. I really struggled. I had, my mental health really, really did suffer. And I think there can be a lot of shame and guilt and isolation when you feel that. So I kind of feel like everything I do in my work, I'm sort of always wearing these two hats where I'm someone with kind of expertise, I guess, just as a psychologist generally, and then also my lived experience expertise, which it just adds another dimension. It doesn't mean that I'm kind of better at this work. It just means I have a different insight into it. And actually, I've really enjoyed that aspect of, I don't know, the working in this way, because I do feel like there's something about integrating these two parts of me, and it really helps me to sort of think about people as humans, like really whole humans.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the work that you do, that, as you say, the shame that comes along with these experiences can be huge for someone. And I think the fact that you talk about your lived experience goes such a long way in de-shaming, destigmatizing an experience that, I mean, we'll get into it, but it's very, very complex, isn't it?
It's really complex, and there's so many things that so many commonalities across these experiences, and also there's a lot of nuance, because everyone's experience is unique to them, and I think we just need to make sure that we don't lose sight of that as we sort of talk about this more, that it's everyone will experience this in their own way, and therefore need their own support, in their own unique type of support.
Definitely. So let's start by thinking a little bit about, what is reproductive trauma? How do you define that in your own mind?
They're big words, right? Reproductive sounds very sciencey, and trauma is obviously a big word. I think it's one we're using much more these days. But the way that I conceptualize it is, it's a bit like an umbrella term. So it's about how people experience difficulties, often very distressing, upsetting difficulties, across that whole reproductive journey, that whole path towards parenthood, if that's where they sort of end up at the end of that journey. So, that can mean things like infertility, struggling to get pregnant, needing to go through fertility treatments. It will encompass the whole spectrum of pregnancy loss, baby loss, from literally, the point of conception all the way up to birth and post-birth. It also includes those experiences like, premature birth. So babies being born too soon, babies being born and needing additional care. So that start to parenthood being really, really difficult, really challenging and traumatic. Birth trauma, obviously we're talking, I think, a lot more broadly about that as well, which is great that we're talking about it, but this is something that impacts so many people. And then also sort of post-birth as well. So people might experience things like breastfeeding trauma. They might find their mental health really suffers after they give birth, that their expectations of what parenting looks like or feels like is just so vastly different. And, all of these things can be traumatic. They can be really, really distressing for people. And so reproductive trauma really is a sort of catch-all term for all of those experiences that we might have. And some of us might have one or two of those, and there might be some of us who have lots of them, like multiple traumas. But I think, given that trying for a baby, having a baby, growing, starting your family is supposed to be this wonderful, really happy time, when it isn't, it can be really shocking, really, really destabilizing as well.
Yeah. Before we get back to the episode, I have got something really exciting to share: our brand new Substack community. This is a space where you can peek behind the scenes of the podcasting process and have a space to connect with other fans of the show. As a subscriber, you'll get a monthly roundup of all the episodes in that month, plus my thoughts and personal reflections on each one, completely free. But if you want to go deeper, a paid subscription unlocks exclusive perks like never heard before guest mini episodes, subscriber only chats, digital downloads, and even the chance to shape future episodes. If that sounds good to you, head to the Substack link in the show notes. Now let's get back to the episode. And you mentioned their mental health. So what would you say are some of the common mental health difficulties, challenges that people might experience if they have gone through a form of reproductive trauma? I appreciate that's a really broad question.
It's a good one though, because I think it's quite it's just very broad, I guess, in terms of what people's experiences are. But I mean, I suppose we can, if we think about things from a more sort of diagnostic mental health kind of end of that spectrum, that lots of people will experience things like depression, or at least very low mood. Lots of people experience anxiety. lots of people and research is starting to show us even more sort of how many people experience PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, from all of these experiences that I just listed. It's possible to then go on to develop PTSD. Yeah. So, it can have a really profound, quite long-lasting impact on your mental health. But I think also the other stuff is that you can just be left with a sense of huge isolation from people because, maybe your friends are having babies at the same time. So you can feel very ostracized and very on the outside of your previous kind of support network. And it can have huge impacts on, your relationships with your friends, with your family, with your partner. And, it can also, what I do tend to find in the work that I do is people come in, obviously feeling lots of different feelings, but it might have activated something quite old for them. So, things that maybe they thought they, didn't have to deal with anymore, or things that had been quite unconscious to them. So things like really huge unrelenting standards, for example, and, knowing that they are people who work really hard and then they are rewarded for that hard work. But having children doesn't kind of work in the same way, that you can do like all the right things and work really hard and not have a positive outcome. So sometimes it can really activate all this stuff that people have been living with for a really long time that then needs to be kind of unpacked and unpicked so that they can kind of move forward in a way that feels safe and that they can live a life that isn't just completely sort of, I guess, determined or overshadowed by this really traumatic experience.
And do you think these days women are sort of falling through the cracks? I guess I was thinking there about particularly birth trauma. So if we just focus on that just for a moment, do people sort of, give birth and then have a healthy baby, but don't really realise that their birth was traumatic? Because I know over the years I've seen a few women who have had that experience, and it's like years later they are in therapy for something else, but in exploring their past, this event comes out, and it really does open up a really old wound that hasn't been looked at or treated.
Absolutely. I think, if we just think about birth trauma specifically, like it's not been that long that has been recognised as something that can cause trauma, that birth can cause trauma. So it is really only in the last sort of like 30 or so years that this has been recognised more formally as something that can result in traumatic symptoms and PTSD. So, if we're working with people where it was a long time ago, then it's even less likely to have been picked up than it is now. I think also what we forget with trauma as well is that trauma is in the eye of the beholder. Like that's what, that's how it's conceptualized. That's how we understand it. And birth, for example, could be, from an obstetric point of view, really straightforward, really quite sort of, in inverted commas, normal. Like it was straightforward, everything was fine from a medical obstetric perspective. But actually that birthing woman, person, or their partner might have experienced that really differently. And there's so many different reasons why that might be, but that then doesn't get picked up because people are thinking, well, the birth was straightforward, the baby's okay, mum's okay, dad's okay. Like no one's asking, but how was that for you? How did you experience that? And we know that the research shows us that about a third of cases where people experience birth trauma, it's interpersonal issues that are the factor that cause that. So 1/3 is often if there's kind of complications for the mum. The other third is if there are complications with the baby. But actually, if we think a third of cases of birth trauma are caused by those interpersonal experiences or interactions that people have during birth, like not being listened to, not being asked for consent, having their experience invalidated, and their pain maybe not being acknowledged. And that stuff is enough to cause birth trauma, but it's not being picked up, it's not being recognised because we don't necessarily, I think we're getting better, but I still think this is very much in its infancy in understanding how and why this happens. And therefore people struggle for years and years. And then maybe, like you say, there might be another trigger that brings them into therapy, for example. And yet actually the thing that you come back to is, it was how this person spoke to me during my birth. And that was the sort of touchstone point that set off all these other things.
And you mentioned earlier about relationships, and I wanted to ask you about that because obviously, whatever experience of reproductive trauma you've had, of course, it's going to impact on those people around you, but also the relationships. So, can you give us an insight into what that might look like and how someone can navigate that if there is a really difficult dynamic going on?
I mean, it's one of those things I think also we don't talk enough about is how that impacts on actually all the different relationships, but certainly like couple relationships, for example. And often the things that I'm talking to people who I work with in therapy about is the feelings that come up when there is a sense that the other person, maybe the other partner, might seem to, on the surface, feel differently or be coping with this really differently. So I work a lot with people where they have sadly lost a baby and they might feel that their partner just isn't sad because they're grieving in a really different way. And there's so many different reasons why that might be. I think, often we have sort of, I think these unconscious, unspoken gender stereotypes about how people are allowed to express their feelings or show their grief. But I think also it's those structures within society that perpetuate that, because often a partner needs to go back to work and they don't get the same time off, for example, because they're not the one who has physically gone through that experience of loss. So I think very early on, if there's a sort of diminishing communication between couples, that then can be sometimes quite hard. If you continue not to talk about this, then we begin in our minds to create these fantasies of they don't care, they think I'm weak for not, or that I'm not moving on. And so in the absence of talking, we just create all these narratives in our mind about what's going on with the other person. And then I think, we have obviously we have lots of relationships in our lives, like friendships and colleagues and other family relationships as well. And some of the problems there might be where those people haven't been able to be there for you. I think essentially they have maybe not understood. They have maybe said some really clumsy, quite hurtful things. Maybe they've said nothing at all. Like they've just, because they've not known what to say. And again, in this sort of like lack of clear communication, then it can just create these huge divisions and rifts between people. And I think this isn't easy stuff to overcome, because as humans, I don't think we're very good at talking and communicating. Like we all wish that people just knew. Like I just wish you could read my mind and know what I want, because I don't want to have to tell you that, well, this is what I want you to do and this is what I don't want you to do. So I think, I suppose communication is the key thing. And I think if you're someone who is supporting someone who's been through loss, I think one of the things that's really good is sort of developing quite thick skin and being able to say, like, can you tell me what you need? Can you tell me if I get this wrong, so that I can do something differently? But I think also it's just being kind of starting to build that muscle of being able to say to people, this is when you do this, or when you don't do that, this is how I feel. Like, often with partners, I'd be talking to them about talking to their partners and saying, when you don't talk about our baby, it makes me feel like you've forgotten. It makes me feel like you don't care. Like, is that true? And that opens that conversation for them to say, more often not what they say is, that's just not true. It's just that I worry about talking about them. I'm worried I'm going to upset you. And all of this is really hard, because I just think, we're just not good at this stuff. I also feel with relationships, and this is my personal experience as well, that you can have the most wonderful people around you, most incredible friends. And, those of us who are psychologists often have a lot of psychologist friends, and they're all really good and they're really thoughtful. And also, if they haven't been through that same experience as you, it's still, they're just never going to really understand. And that's okay. Like that's just the sad reality of life. And there's going to be things that you don't understand about their life as well. And that's where I found it really important to sort of build other relationships and connections with people who do get it. And then I can get that need met for like real deep connection and real deep like understanding from those people, so that I don't need that as much from people who I just can't get that from. I think community is just such a huge thing when it comes to sort of getting through anything, like any kind of reproductive trauma and loss experiences. You just can't do this on your own.
And picking up on what you said a little bit earlier, I think we're generally just not very good at talking about death.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
Particularly when it's in the reproductive arena, or if you've lost a baby, it is so difficult to talk about. And a lot of the time, people who haven't experienced it directly just don't know what to say, because that obviously there's a logical understanding that loss that someone has experienced is profound, and words aren't going to cut it. So I think that's why, if you haven't experienced that, you just don't say anything, because then, as you say, you can't upset someone, and you can sort of say platitudes, but it's, as you say, it's not the same as when someone has experienced that and kind of just knows.
Exactly. Because it's, I think at the core of it, humans just want other people to feel okay. Like, we just want other people to feel okay. Whilst we know that that's not possible all of the time, it's often in our interactions, that's what we're trying to do, is to make someone else feel safe, good, happy. And like you say, no words are going to make someone feel happy. It's this completely unfixable thing. It can feel very hopeless. It's very dark. Like, I imagine that I was very difficult to spend time with in those early days and weeks, maybe even months after our daughter died, because it's dark. It's really, really dark. And sometimes all you want is someone just to kind of be there next to you, holding your hand, not really even saying anything, but just like, I'm here, and I'm here when you're feeling good, I'm here when you're not feeling so good. But that, it actually takes a lot of courage and bravery, I think, to be around someone who's in a very, very bad place, because it's like, it's in the air. You can you can feel it. Like, if you walk into someone's house, you know that it's a sad house right now. This is really, like, you can almost cut it in the air. It's
going to be like that for a long time. And I think that's the other thing, isn't it? Particularly when we're talking about partners, it's this event has changed, or will have changed, your relationship forever.
Exactly.
And it's how do you begin to navigate that journey, that relationship journey, that new relationship that you're in, having experienced this loss together?
Because it changes you individually as people. And I think, sort of becoming parents changes you as well. And I think that can be really shocking for people, that, wow, I don't feel like the same person, and we're certainly not the same couple anymore, because it's not just us anymore. And I think, that is the same whether you have a live baby or, you have a baby that has died. And it is about, I think you have to sort of learn how to get to know this new version of yourself, and how you get to know this new version of you as a couple. And kind of, sometimes there's a grieving, this is, I suppose, those secondary losses that come with death and grief, is that you're grieving who you once were, and then with time, finding light and joy in who you are now. And those things do sit side by side. They sit very uncomfortably at the beginning, because we just want to go back. I don't want to be this version of me. But over time, that there is this sort of like, there's an integration of these two things. And, like you say, it doesn't ever go away. This is like, it's a long-term thing, but there is hope. There are ways forward. And I think that that's really important to remember as well, because otherwise it can feel very hopeless and like, well, this is just all awful. It's not awful forever, but there's moments of awfulness forever. Does that make sense?
And what would you say is, if someone's listening to this and they are in that fog of grief, having lost a baby, what would you say to them in terms of how to navigate that? That's, I guess, the sort of those first few days, weeks, months. What would you say?
I think in those early days, it literally is just get through each minute, and then it might be get through each hour, and then get through maybe the morning and then the afternoon. you have to have such small expectations, which is really hard. I think, often you can go literally overnight like that in a moment from being someone who is confident, busy, active, out there doing life, to suddenly feeling like, actually, I can't even leave my house. This is too much. I can't open the front door. I don't want to talk to anyone. I can't go out. And I think what I would say to anyone who's there right now is, it's not going to feel like this forever, but it might feel like this for a while. And that's okay. You just need to take small steps. Always ask for help if you need it. Allow people to help you. Allow people to do. People do want to help often. They do want to do things, and sometimes it's hard to accept help because particularly if we're sort of hyper independent people. It was something I found very, very difficult, and it did not serve me well. So I would just say, if there are offers of help, take them. But also I would just say, look, just don't do this on your own. That there are other people who are going through this. And when you feel ready to, find them in the way that feels good and safe for you. So for me at the beginning, it was very much, I would just need to read other people's stories. I just needed to know that there are other people there thinking the things I was thinking, feeling the things I was feeling. So I read blogs. It was back in the day where blogs were a thing. They're not really so much a thing anymore. But blogs, I just find those. The big charity websites like SANS and Tommy's and the Miscarriage Association. They've got so many people's stories on there. So I remember just consuming them. I just needed to trying to gobble them up because I needed to know that I wasn't on my own. And obviously social media now, you can find lots of people just using sort of the hashtag sort of searches. But I would just say, just find connection, find community, and also just, if you can do nothing else, just meet your basic needs. Just make sure that you're eating, that if you can sort of have a shower, get changed. And actually, if that's all you do in a day, then that's brilliant. That's enough. And then next day you might be able to build on that and get a bit more done, and feel like you're building up your sort of resilience again. And then, if it is getting really hard, ask for help. There is help out there. I 100% appreciate it's not always that easy to find, but if you are, and obviously it will depend sort of in terms of when your loss was and what support is available. But if you've got a midwife or your GP, or if you do have sort of maybe health support through work, trying to find somewhere or someone who can support you through this. I always talk to people about, it's like you need scaffolding through this time. You're so vulnerable. You're like this little sapling tree that needs that. When they put those cones around them, don't they, until they're sort of strong enough to stand up by themselves. That's what you need for a period of time. You need to be held up, and gradually you do get stronger. It is possible, but it's like hold tight and just take it back to the bare essentials at the beginning.
So really lower those expectations.
And then lower them again.
Yeah. And I think the kind of conversations that I've had over the years, and a theme that has come up when I work with people who have experienced reproductive trauma, is a sense of utter betrayal with their bodies. My body has not done the thing that I needed it to do, or it should have done. I failed, or my body's failed, and so not only can there be a huge impact on relationships externally, with your partner, friends, etc., but also the relationship with yourself. That relationship can be massively impacted. What would you say about how to start repairing, I suppose, that relationship and that self-connection?
It's so hard, this one, I think, because that is something that's so, and I can really relate to that sort of sense of how did this happen on my watch? How did this happen in my own body? And even with early losses, your body changes so much that you're sort of left with this different vessel and no baby. It's like this huge trigger. Your body can be a huge trigger, and so I remember things like taking a shower would be really difficult because it's I just don't want to acknowledge this. This is really awful. I think I think the other thing to also note here is that if you've ever had any difficulties with body image before, that can be a really vulnerable time of those sorts of things resurfacing for people.
Yeah.
So it might be even more tricky. There might be another layer of this for those people who've maybe had those difficulties either in the recent or very distant past.
Mhm.
I think it's going to be, and for that reason, I think that stuff is going to be, in terms of what helps, going to be different for different people. For some people, they're going to really need maybe some therapy to really work through that. Sometimes I think it's that just like graded exposure to things as well. It's like, right, I find it very hard to relate to my body and connect with it, but the one thing I can do for it right now is just to nourish it. So I'm going to make sure that I'm putting in food and water and meeting my basic needs.
Yeah.
Sort of later down the line, you might want to sort of, maybe think a bit more about sort of that graded exposure to actually even like, for some people, like looking at your body or even touching your body can be very, very difficult because you feel so disconnected. One thing that I think is really like not great about care, there's a lot of things maybe that aren't great about care post loss for people, but I think the physical gets really ignored. People don't tend to get follow-ups in terms of like how is your body, how's your pelvic floor, how are you physically healing and recovering from your birth experience. And there's not that much out there, but there's someone, if you actually search online, who runs something called the PABL project. So it's physiotherapy after baby loss. It's a PABL project, and they focus on that sort of postnatal recovery specifically for people who've been through loss. And I think that is really important because that stuff, like, are you doing your pelvic floor exercises? That kind of stuff gets forgotten when you're in the depths of grief and trauma. So it's kind of knowing that there's stuff out there to try and kind of get access to. But if you're lucky, this sounds awful, like if you're lucky, because like it shouldn't be about luck. It should be just everyone should get this. But going to your GP and having a postnatal check, getting them to have a real sort of look at how you're doing as well, because often people feel very scared of what's going on with their body afterwards. They don't know, they haven't been told maybe that they're going to bleed for a certain amount of time or that their body's going to change in this way. And sometimes we just need information to kind of go, this is okay, this is normal, or this is not, and you need to come in and we need to sort of check things over. So it's like, it's psychological, it's physical, it's and like I say, it could be about old stuff that gets reactivated that needs a bit of working through.
And the other thing that can come up is triggers, right? Like other people's baby showers or pregnancy announcements, or even just seeing a pregnant person in the street can, sort of take you back there, or it can be so difficult, can't it, for people?
Yeah, the world becomes really dangerous when you're in that place. Like, you just, because it's so unpredictable. You don't know who you're going to see. I do remember going out for a walk probably a few weeks after our daughter had died, and seeing someone in the distance with a pram who actually I knew from like sort of NCT, and just having a full-blown panic attack and running home and going and hiding in the sort of the room in the loft, like the furthest away that I could get, and just sobbing uncontrollably, because it's like it just activates just all the awfulness of this. This is so unfair, this is so painful, and also I just feel scared. The world feels really scary. And I think if that's all very normal at the beginning, like that's a really sort of understandable, normal response. And sometimes I think the way you deal with it is to make your world a bit smaller and protect yourself. And my world was my home for a period of time. I didn't really want to go out, or if I did go out, I'd make sure I went out in like the evening, because people don't tend to be out with their babies in the evening, so safer to walk the streets then. And that was the right thing to do for a period of time. And then my life had to grow. I had to start doing things and going out. So then I had to start building another toolkit of things to try and keep myself safe. Sunglasses were a big thing, so that if I did have a cry, then I could do it and no one would really see. headphones so you can pretend not to hear people, or turn something up really loud if you hear something you don't want to hear. And then you have maybe some of those more sort of safety behaviours that help you to feel safe. And then if those things kind of continue sort of longer term, then what I would be encouraging people to do is maybe seek out some help, because avoidance is protective in the short term, but obviously it's really hard to sustain in the long term. But sometimes what we don't recognize as humans is that it's okay to set boundaries as well and know your limits. And actually, for some people for a very, very long time, maybe they're just not going to be able to hang out with friends who are pregnant, or go to baby showers, or receive birth announcements like through texts. And it comes back to communication, really, like how are we communicating with people, saying, actually, I'm opting out of this group chat right now because I just can't, I'm really sorry, I can't do it. Setting that sort of zone of safety for yourself. And, sort of sometimes we have to do that for a period of time. And then it's always good to reassess, because sometimes we can surprise ourselves at some point. We're like, actually, this doesn't really sting as much anymore. Actually, I do see that scan photo and I don't feel, I don't know, it's not really bringing up as much. So I think it's good to sort of check in with it every so often. But it's always that balance of, sort of saying this is okay and this is understandable for what you've been through. But then when does it start to veer into, actually, this is maybe something that might indicate something like PTSD. And actually, with some really good, effective therapy and treatment for that, the world won't feel so scary, and it won't feel like you need to have all of these safety behaviours and boundaries and things in place. And that's something that is, it's very nuanced, isn't it? It's kind of it's something that you have to work out normally with someone else and discuss what feels right for you.
And as you say, that idea of sort of the safety behaviours, right? The things that help you feel safe, particularly at the beginning, are really important. But it can be really difficult to know when that veers into something that's not so healthy for you in the long term. And maybe that's when somebody, as you say, would see a professional or mental health professional, therapist.
I think also sometimes it's interesting. I was running some training this week with some perinatal healthcare professionals, and we were talking about, like, an example of this is going for scans, for example, when you're pregnant again, which is just one of the most unbelievably challenging. I can't even put into words how hard a pregnancy after loss is, and you're constantly seeking out anything that's going to give you some reassurance, some sense of control, some sense of safety.
Sure.
And we find that lots of people will then want to go for scans, for example, because in that moment, you are getting some reassurance that, okay, this baby is fine. There's a heartbeat. They're still alive. It's fine. But obviously that reassurance literally lasts for that moment. You might get a bit of respite for, I don't know, half an hour afterwards. But often by the time you leave that building, you're already questioning things. And sometimes it's doing that pros and cons analysis of how helpful is this? Because there's a lot of build up to having a scan, for example. You can be really, really stressed and overwhelmed and worried about it. And you're constantly having to weigh up that balance of, is this helpful? Is it not? Maybe it was then, but it's not now. And now I need to think about something else that's going to give me that sense of safety. But it's really hard, because ultimately with all of this stuff, we just want to feel safe. That's all of this stuff is just that human innate desire to feel like, I'm okay, this is going to be okay. And I guess the other thing there is just about compassion. We just have to have deep, deep compassion for how hard this is. And like it is, it's just so hard. It's so hard.
So what is one piece of advice that you might, or encouragement that you might give someone who's listening, who is in the aftermath of reproductive trauma and is really struggling with that? Again, I appreciate, giving one bit of advice is really difficult, because I'm sure there's so many things that are helpful, but what would be at the top of your list in terms of something that would be helpful for someone?
I feel like I don't know, it's at the top of the list, or it's almost like I imagine this as being like a foundation point for moving forward. It's not never about moving on, but it's about how do you move forward after something really difficult. And I feel like all the stuff we've spoken about before, like building community or asking for help and that stuff, I think that only can happen if at the base, at the foundation of this, that you are validating your experience and saying, wow, this feels really hard. And of course it feels hard because this has been really, really awful. And it's okay that it's not never okay that we're struggling, but it makes sense that I'm struggling and that I deserve to get some help so that I don't struggle anymore. So I'd almost say that piece of advice is about self-validation and self-compassion, because it's with those things, even if they're just tiny little glimmers of those things, they can help you then go on the way to sort of say, actually, and because of that, I'm going to find this help or support, or I'm going to do this for myself. I think without that, what we find is people just bury it, ignore it, try and carry on as normal. They say, oh, it doesn't matter, or other people have it worse, and, I should be able to cope with this, and so I'm just going to ignore that and just carry on. But ultimately then it's going to pop up at some other point, isn't it? So I would say those things like self-validation, self-compassion, if you can start to just have this glimmer of like cultivating that, that's your first step then in starting to get your needs met on this process.
Well, I have so many more questions to ask you, but we've run out of time. I really appreciate you talking about your lived experience of loss, because I think that so many people are going to find that really, really helpful. So I really appreciate you doing that today with us.
Oh, thank you. Joe, it's like, it's not always easy, but it's definitely, I think it is, I found it so helpful to hear about other people. So it's like this sort of, it's almost like passing it on. I benefited from hearing about other people's experiences. So I feel like I kind of owe that to the universe to sort of pass that on. And I know that then other people will do that for other people. And I think that ultimately that's where healing happens. It's with other people, it's in communities.
Yeah. And the last thing that I would say is that you have an amazing Substack. So I get your emails every week, and the way that you articulate your ideas and just the way that you write is amazing. And I think everyone should sign up to your Substack.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I really enjoy writing it as well. There's something just really, Substack's a great place. Like, it's a really cool place to hang out, find new people doing writing. But that's From the Other Chair is my newsletter on there. And it very much is about reflecting on life from both sides of the therapy room, both chairs, because I've been in both and learned just as much from both sides of the room.
Well, thanks so much for coming today, Michelle.
Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure. And like you say, it's such a big topic. And I know that we sort of only scratched the surface, but hopefully it's been sort of helpful for people to start thinking about that and going away and reading a bit more about it as well, because there is some really good literature out there and support. So hopefully it's setting people on that pathway.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hello Therapy. If you found it helpful, don't forget to subscribe, follow and review. You can get more well-being and mental health tips by joining our email list and visiting the resources section of our website at harleyclinical.co.uk. The Hello Therapy podcast and the information provided by me, Dr. Liz White, is solely intended for information and educational purposes and does not constitute personalised advice. Please do reach out to your GP or a mental health professional if you need support. Until next time, take care of yourself.